Welcome to the WellCast. The world has a lot to say. We're bringing a biblical perspective to those conversations.
Welcome to another episode of the WellCast. We are so grateful to be coming to you with another episode. I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Jordan Hogue. What's up, Hoagie?
Mike, you're the wind beneath my wings.
Thank you. That's the kindest thing anyone said to me this morning.
You're like my baby angel cherubim. I appreciate you, man.
You used to like to picture me in a diaper?
I'm just so thankful for you. Well, actually, if you, if you play it out,
Yeah.
I don't think they wear anything, but I don't picture you anyway. I don't think about you at all outside this room. You don't exist.
All right.
Yeah, what the listeners don't know is we get out of this room, we don't talk.
Yeah.
We have a purely professional relationship.
Or it's the opposite of that. You call me night and day.
It's true.
And long to
I need
be.
my tuckies at night.
You asked me to move into my house. That was weird.
I thought all good co-hosts should live together. Yeah. Our wives and families can live in another house. It's fine.
So we didn't do that.
Yeah.
But we did decide, let's do another episode.
And let's start it the weirdest way possible.
Yeah.
But I love it. It wouldn't be us if it wasn't us.
They get to know our... Well, mostly your weird personality.
Yeah, all these things were started with me. I admit this.
It's good. Our episode today
is in a series.
Is part of our series on world religions.
religions.
Wow, you're good. That's because we live together.
I'm feeling jacked today, dude. I'm ready for this one.
This is gonna be. Who knows what you're gonna say?
I don't know.
I don't. But we're continuing on in that series. And we're gonna talk a little bit about the Buddha and
Or Buddhism. Yeah.
Both.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna mess around getting enlightened right now.
Yeah. So our episode on Buddhism, and again, we repeat every single time, our hope is that we just cast a little bit of light, give you a little taste for another world religion, and maybe you do a little more research on your own.
Yeah.
And maybe we just kind of wet your whistle.
We would love to create a sense of understanding for what these religions are so that you can have educated conversations with people who you love.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting about Buddhism is the timing of us recording this episode.
Yeah, you just went to Cambodia.
I did. I just got back from Cambodia, and it was really encouraging. First of all, love AIM. Just a little shout out for Agape International
tell us a little about
missions. AIM is doing incredible work there in a country that is about 1% Christian. They've through the gospel, they've started to see God transform a whole city, which is fascinating. But if it's 1% Christian, then it's predominantly other religions, and that main religion is Buddhism. So it's 93% Buddhist there, and
I also think I cut you off. It's Agape International Ministries, right?
missions.
Missions.
Yeah,
Okay.
AIM.
Yeah. I wanted people to know.
Yeah, and they rescue girls out of human trafficking. It's a really sad story how they end up in human trafficking, but what God's doing there is fantastic.
Yeah, look them up. They're amazing.
So incredible, but also...
So you had a lot of exposure to Buddhism while you were there.
Yeah, because we stayed in Phnom Penh, and we literally stayed across the street from the Royal Palace. So like out some of our windows, you could see like the Royal Palace, and the Royal Palace has a ton of these like Buddhist statues and different like it's not like Hinduism, which we'll get into next week. They're not like individual kind of gods, but they're these Buddhist statues. And
yeah, I believe the tallest statues in the world are of Buddha.
Yeah, and it's just fascinating. They're everywhere in Cambodia, and so it was just interesting as we were walking down the streets. The reminder of like what it would have been like in the Old Testament, like when they're setting up all of these statues, all of these shrines, all these false gods, and you're walking around and you're going, they're beautiful statues. Like I understand why people would be interested in these statues. They're incredible works of craftsmanship, and they just are amazing to look at, and they kind of draw you in, and then you realize, well, that's actually false religion. It's actually false gods. And so, yeah, it's everywhere in Cambodia, and it was interesting walking through there. So anyway, that's my story on Buddhism, but
Did you visit like a temple or anything like that?
We didn't. We walked around, like there was a museum and stuff that we went to. Our trip was more centered around like the history of Cambodia, not the religion of Cambodia, and spending time with AIM. But it was just interesting walking around, seeing all of the different statues and all the different the monks that were walking around were fascinating. Like they had phones, like Apple iPhones. I had no clue, but like apparently, they walk around and people just give them money, and they had iPhones. I thought that they would just lived in solitude, but that's not the case. They were just walking around. So we saw these monks everywhere in these orange robes that were walking around. So the exposure to Buddhism was just really pretty fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I guess let's get into the more educational portion of this podcast.
Yeah, let's talk about Buddhism and what it is, how it started, what they believe. So Buddhism started, they believe, somewhere around like 563 to 483 BC. So it's in opposition to Islam, which we talked about last week, which was last episode, which was the only or the youngest major religion in the world. This goes, predates Christ. And so it starts back then. And basically the idea is that this one prince, this prince from northern India, kind of near Nepal, basically went on this journey of enlightenment. And he says he reached that enlightenment, and then he became the Buddha. And so that's kind of the beginning of how Buddhism started. And really it was birthed out of this northern part of India.
Yeah, I think I didn't know before studying this that it was actually an Indian religion to begin with.
Yeah, and it was predominantly Indian for a long time until actually later in history, the Muslims came through and actually defeated in India and erased Buddhism from that part of the world, even though it had already started to spread to other portions of like Southeast and Eastern Asia.
Yeah, I know that there was what's interesting about the beginning of Buddhism to me is that it is actually a denial of a god.
Yeah.
And so the man who eventually I don't want to mess around trying to pronounce his name. I feel like that's a lose.
That's why I skipped over it.
But like he reached enlightenment eventually, but in that path he denied the traditional Hindu beliefs of God, of Brahma, things like that. And it is actually, and this is more belief than history, but it is actually more of a what they would call an atheistic religion.
Yeah, there's no personal relationship with the God. Ultimately, the religion of Buddhism is a admiration, or maybe even stronger than that, like an adoration of the Buddha and ancestors that have come before. And the goal of Buddhism, which we'll get into, as we walk down the beliefs, the goal really is this enlightenment that they want to achieve through their life.
Yeah, many people don't know, but they just believe truly that Buddha is another man.
Yeah.
He is revered because he's the one who sort of laid out this path towards enlightenment for them. But it is not a theistic religion. They do believe that there are certain holy beings that could be around in the earth, but that they don't have any investment in mankind.
Yeah.
And that there is no real, like, true divine being. It's simply becoming one with everything when you're enlightened.
Yeah, and we'll talk through. I mean, there's a bit more to that than just the summary, but there's about 400 million Buddhists worldwide, and here in the United States, about like 2.5 million. And so there's a chance that you have come into contact with, someone who is a Buddhist, and we want to make sure we equip you to really understand what they believe and how we can engage with them, and share Jesus with them. That's our ultimate goal. I mean, we don't hide that, right?
Yeah.
Like the ultimate goal is to share the gospel. That's as Christians, that's where our hope is found. And this this religion in particular, as we get into their beliefs, is really a religion that seems to need hope. Mm-hmm. Because the end result of their belief system is not filled with hope. We'll get into that in a little bit.
Yeah.
But there's some core beliefs in Buddhism, so I figured we'd walk through that. They're numbered. So there's 4 noble truths, and then there's a noble 8-fold path. Those are the biggest things about the Buddhist religion. And so the 4 noble truths are these.
Yeah, which are the dharmas, right? The teachings of Buddha.
Yeah, the teachings of Buddha. So 4 noble truths, which one is life is full of suffering.
Suffering exists.
Yeah, suffering exists, which is, that's
pretty universal.
Part of life. Number 2, suffering is caused by craving.
Craving. You can also substitute that for desire.
Yeah. Or deep desire. So I think that's number 2. Number 3, suffering will cease only when craving ceases.
Yeah.
So it's very self-willed religion. We have to do the work to cause our deny ourself, and only through denial of our own desires can we cease the cravings, and then thus can we get rid of suffering, which is that's the idea of enlightenment, right? Is they want to end suffering in their life here, which is in direct opposition, before we get to the 4th one, direct opposition to the Christian worldview, right? Because we say suffering cannot be ended here in this life. And that's what the afterlife is all about, life with Christ and eternity with Christ, is that's where suffering ceases. And here it's all about identifying with Christ's suffering for the Christian and the brokenness of the fall of man. And then eternity is the place where we experience the ceasing of suffering. The Buddhist faith would say, no, we can accomplish that through self-denial and the ceasing of cravings or desire here on earth, and that's their goal.
I think the sort of counterintuitiveness of the gospel, when you talk about a Buddhist worldview and as it meets the gospel, saying that desire is suffering is bad, the desires to get, you want to there is, I think you'll find a contradiction even in the talking, right? Which is you do have a desire for enlightenment.
Sure.
And so therefore you need to destroy desire,
which creates suffering if you don't get there.
Yeah. So I think there's there's probably ways to philosophize around that, but that was something that kind of kept coming to my mind. But, the Christian message is that suffering actually brought about the life of all of mankind.
Right.
And anybody who's brought back to life from death spiritually is brought back from death by way of the cross.
Yep.
And the cross is the most unjust suffering that's ever existed, but brought life to man.
Yeah, and in that we identify as Christians with that suffering.
And even the New Testament teaching that suffering brings joy.
Yeah.
And that's counterintuitive to the worldview of a Buddhist.
It is. And the reason why we kind of stopped after the 3rd one and just kind of commented on it is because the 4th one is all about how you can achieve those first 3 things.
Yeah.
So the 4th of the noble truths is this noble 8-fold path. And so these 8 things that the Buddha outlined are the ways you achieve ceasing cravings and
gaining freedom from suffering.
Therefore, getting freedom from suffering.
That's the 4th assertion, is that the Eightfold Path is the way to gain freedom from suffering.
Yep.
Yeah, and which is, I don't know. I don't think we need to list all 8, but it's all about right living, basically.
Yeah, right living. So, we can maybe list them really quick, just so
okay,
we are clear.
Sure. If you have a pen and pencil.
Yeah, but just to paint a picture of what it looks like, I think it's important to understand. It's right views, right aspiration, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right contemplation. And so, obviously, right is a big theme.
And there's an assertion of truth in that, right? I think what's interesting is a lot of times, as I was studying Buddhism, you have the belief that, some of these Eastern religions is they kind of free themselves from the constraints of truth claims or, all these things. But I think every religion makes a truth claim.
Yeah.
And this is literally saying there are right ways to live, which can free you from the karmic cycle of suffering.
Well, and I think the question that then begs itself is where's that standard, right? Because for the Christian, the standard of right living, even though we're not predominantly a the Bible is not predominantly a moralistic message, right? It's a message of grace.
Yeah, it contains ethics, but through a person.
Yeah, the standard of ethics is found in the Christian scriptures. So the Old Testament, New Testament, especially the New Testament, as we look back and the things that Jesus affirms in the New Testament, looking at the Old Testament. But there's not a huge standard other than what the Buddha says. There's no divine standard of truth.
Yeah, which is actually really interesting because it's created huge, large, different sections or cross sections of Buddhism, which practice differently.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that the one thing, we mentioned the lack of future hope, right? And so the interesting part is, as we've walked through this whole series, every kind of religion has some sort of afterlife, right? It's pretty common amongst most religions, but when you get to these Far Eastern religions, specifically the one we're talking about today, there's no afterlife.
Yeah.
The goal is enlightenment before you die.
Yeah.
And then you're extinct at that point. You cease to live.
Yeah, the goal is nothingness.
Yeah, no concept of a soul, no concept of the ongoing life of the soul.
I think that one of the things that a lot of Eastern religions carry between each other is the idea of karmic cycles.
Yeah.
Right? So if you want to think of a framework for things like Buddhism and Hinduism on basic levels that they can all agree on, is you have karma, which contributes to your reincarnation, which is a cycle of rebirth.
Right.
And which is always happening until you reach that eventual goal.
Yeah, and then the difference between the religions is what happens after that, right?
Yeah.
But for Buddhism, after you reach, so you live, you die, you recycle, and once you reach enlightenment, you just stop. It's almost as if the suffering's over. Like the goal is the ceasing of suffering, and that only comes through reincarnation over and over and over again. So that's the kind of the end goal of Buddhists.
And they would most branches of Buddhism would say that those who are monks who are disconnecting themselves from desires more intentionally are closer to enlightenment.
And so that they're meant to be the ones that are to help others to get to that place.
To teach them.
And what's interesting about that is that redefines the definition of life, right? So in Buddhism, life is a penalty, whereas in Christianity, life is a gift from God. Like it may include suffering, right? But when we read through the Bible, we see that God created us because He loves us, because He desires us, because He wants us. That it was the sin of man that marred the original design for life. Yeah. But that God redeems that life through Jesus. And then when we die in faith, when we place our faith in Jesus and then die, we get to experience that original design for life.
Yeah. And oftentimes things like the karmic cycle really devalue life. It puts a lens upon life in which, you and I, if we're in some sort of karmic cycle of rebirth, then what we're currently participating in is one tiny piece of that karmic cycle, whether contributing good or bad to that. Yeah. And we're just going to be eternally in this thing. Yeah. And so you, Mike, don't matter. Right. I, Jordan, don't matter. Yeah. And our personhood is not important. And so truly, I think it is very difficult to live consistently as a Buddhist. Yeah. You have the Dalai Lama, right? Who's supposed to be one of the enlightened ones who stayed behind to guide. Yep. And, what is his desire? To create peace in Tibet. Yeah. And that's his there are these countries that he gets behind and he throws his weight behind, and a desire to create peace and reform, which are beautiful things. But I would say that they have to borrow from our systems of thought, like Western Christian thoughts, to believe that that's a thing of value. And really the best thing that they can say is like, he chooses to do that. Not necessarily that he desires that.
Or that it should be done.
Yeah, desire is counterintuitive.
Right.
And so if he desires peace, why would he even bring himself to a place where they have any effect on his desires?
The very pursuit of peace and failure to achieve it brings suffering to the enlightened one.
Yeah, and
which
so
is problematic.
It is a religion which I think on the surface is it seems very peaceful, but there is a deep contradictions in the way you live your life. I mean, being a Buddhist that has a family.
Yeah.
Like, what do you do with that? You know, being a Buddhist that owns a business, what do you do with that?
Well, expand on that a little bit.
All of those things are born of desire.
Yeah.
If you have a love for a person where you want to create kids, if you have kids where you want the best for them, those are all born of some sort of deep need or desire that Buddhism does not affirm.
Yeah.
It actually asks you to run away from that.
And even, the eightfold path to enlightenment is full of desires, right? Desire to live rightly.
Yeah.
And so it becomes very problematic that the very thing you need to do to achieve enlightenment is the very thing that would keep you from achieving enlightenment. And so, that's a problematic. And the other problematic piece, which we've already touched on a lot, is this lack of objective truth in the belief system. Like the objective truth only comes from a divine authority. And when humanity tries to create its own truth, because we're all equal, because we all have equal value, because there's no ability to have divine truth in a belief system like Buddhism.
That's so interesting too, because I find another contradiction in the fact that like Buddha saw the system of Hinduism with its 333 million gods and said, that's wrong.
Yeah.
He made an objective truth claim in order to birth Buddhism, which rejects objective truth.
Yeah, and any truth system that is defined by a fallible humanity at some place it breaks down.
Yeah,
right. Even the most benevolent dictator that's ever lived, at some point, not only did he die and somebody else take over, but his truths at some point they became not appropriate or not enough to govern whatever system that he's governing. So that's just my way of trying to point out that we, in order to get objective truth, we have to have that come from a God.
Well, and I think one of those objective truths is that every human being is valuable.
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily ring true in Buddhism, because if you are given your lot of karma, whatever position you're at in there's no idea of systemic injustice.
Yeah.
If you are given something, you deserve the thing.
Yeah.
Because that is what you are born into. If you're born into a family that has to work, bone-breaking hours to barely get by, and that's just what the system is giving you, or you have to sell your body in order to get by, or sell your kids into slavery to get by.
Which is what's happening in Cambodia. That's the experience that I had is they have, for a lot of different reasons, right? There's history of genocide and different things, but there's a different value of life there that allows parents to, when things get tough, to sell their kids because they're not every parent, right?
Yeah.
But
it's a horrifying choice.
Yeah, but a lot of them, the kids are an object. So, it's something that they own.
Yeah.
And so when you get down to it, I mean, how many people have sold their car because they had no other way to make the bills, to them, that's what their kids are. And it is that lack of value in the Buddhist system.
You have to place a Christian worldview over that in order to believe that it's an injustice.
Yeah.
And I would say that that people in a Buddhist culture can believe that because I think God's built it in them.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's what Buddha gives you.
Yeah, I think you're right. So I think the question is just how do we then, knowing what we know about, the Buddhist religion, how do we then share Jesus with this,
I think you can hear a lot of the contradictions that we've mapped out. And like we always say, like you can use them as whipping, tools or clubs for people. But I would say that that's not really the ever the best way to approach a relationship.
Yeah.
So I think things like meditation and prayer are huge in the Eastern religions. And so most of the time when you talk with somebody who is Buddhist or Hindu, they will be very comfortable with the idea of prayer. So I would encourage you to tell them that you're praying for them.
Yeah.
I would encourage you, story is very large too, right? Much of Buddhism is derived from these narratives and stories of, people who are enlightened, their own personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
Revelation 12:11 tells us that the holds of Satan are destroyed by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony.
Mm-hmm.
And the blood of the Lamb being the gospel.
Yeah.
So you can share the gospel, but I would encourage you to start with your own story.
Yeah.
Many of these people have their own stories of the ways that they've experienced their religious system.
Sure.
Or somebody in their family that may have become a monk.
Yeah.
And have taught them and given them principles to live by. And so I would encourage you to let them know, hey, what are the incredible ways that Jesus has worked in your family's life, in your life personally? How have you felt a sense of peace? How have you been released from your own, bondage to sin and suffering? And then how have you found freedom in Christ? And speak to these pieces that they want and desire, but from the lens of Jesus and how he's done it in your life.
I think that's great. And I would maybe add just a couple of other things on top of that, because I think those are really great ways to go about it. I think the other thing is to connect with their belief system, right? So they have this 8-fold path to enlightenment. Well, each one of those things the Bible speaks into.
Yeah.
So, you've got right views, and you've got right aspiration, and right speech, and right conduct, and right livelihood, and right effort, right mindfulness, and right contemplation. All of those things are found in the Bible. They just come from a divine source. And so I think you can walk them through that. And the other place is their goal, right? We've already laid it out in this episode. Their goal is to end suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's Jesus's goal too. Not in this world, but in the next. So I think there's a interest that you can bring to the table of the truth that Jesus came to end suffering. It's just experienced differently than what the Buddhists would hope to achieve here on earth. That we don't have to go through life 20 or 30 times in order to achieve enlightenment. It's actually available through the free gift of Christ that he paid on the cross. And when we die, we will have that absence of suffering. And so I think the afterlife, the promises of what the Bible teaches are pivotal to sharing Jesus with someone who has a beautiful.
You have to remember, if you're in a Western context, especially a Christian Western context, like your frameworks are so deeply different.
Yeah.
They believe that the body is bad and that it is to be escaped.
Yeah.
We believe that the body is fundamentally a gift.
Right.
And that it is corrupted by sin, but that God will actually remake our bodies and heaven will be a physical recreated place someday.
Yep.
That's just like totally outside of their purview.
It is.
And so remember, you're speaking different languages in some ways. Even when you use words like born again.
Yeah.
Like that can get very confusing.
Well, because they think of karma, right?
Yeah, reincarnation and karma. Like you need to be careful with how you speak to them, with them about our faith and emphasize pieces. I love the idea of you sitting down with the Eightfold Path and being like, tell me like what your view of right living is.
Yeah.
And let me tell you how God enters into that.
Right.
And how he makes that possible through the gospel.
Yeah.
And let me tell you my perspective.
Yeah.
And because ultimately, if somebody's living under the crushing weight of the karmic cycle, I can't imagine a world where they don't hear the gospel. And even if they're not willing to accept it, don't think like, that feels very free.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. I think you're right. And so our hope is that, for those of you who are listening and you've got some Buddhists in your life, that this might equip you to share the hope of the gospel with them through relationship and in love with compassion. So we hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we will see you next time on the WellCast.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the WellCast. As always, don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends about us. For more information about the Well Community Church, visit thewellcommunity.org.